Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the August 2024 edition of Socialism for All, and today we're going to take a closer look at Russian fascist Alexander Dugin and some of those he has inspired, including Infracel of the recently formed American quote-unquote Communist Party, or ACP. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon or buy me a coffee at patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. There are links to Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee in the video description. So what we're going to do in this video is a critical reading of a document from 1997 called Fascism, Borderless and Red by Alexander Dugin, which should really leave little to the imagination in terms of whether he is a fascist or not. Now, some people will say, oh, this is an older document, he doesn't believe that anymore, but A, he was 35 when he did this, and B, even if you look at more recent works like The Fourth Political Theory from the early 2010s, it's not really any better. It's a little more subtle, but it's not any less fascist. And what do we mean anyway when we talk about it's not less fascist? What is fascism? Well, we just did a very long audiobook, it's 13 hours long, by Rajani Palm Dutt, titled Fascism and Social Revolution. Fascism is essentially a political movement of the bourgeoisie to prevent the proletarian revolution in the age of imperialism. And by imperialism, we mean the Leninist sense, advanced monopoly capitalism. See Lenin's Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, for details. And yes, imperialism is a stage of capitalism. It's not just what the West does. The West happened to get there first, but it is neither intrinsic to the West. If the West undergoes socialist revolution, then it will cease to be imperialist, nor is it exclusive to the West. The West happened to get there first, but as other, including non-Western economies, catch up and reach that stage of capitalism, they too will start to behave in all of the ways that Lenin described in Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, and other works on that topic. In other words, they will go questing after increased market share in the world imperialist system, and when normal business negotiations and political diplomacy break down, they will go to war for that increased market share, because that's what imperialists have to do. They have to keep pursuing profit. And so you get an inter-imperialist war, like World War I. And also like World War II, although there were also anti-communist elements to World War II, a war against the USSR, so it was not exclusively an inter-imperialist war, which makes it more complicated. But anyway, fascism is what the imperialists do when social fascism, or social democracy, breaks down. When social democracy is no longer sufficient to keep the workers hemmed in, pursuing the futile path of reformism, by which we mean mere reformism. Marxists will, on a case-by-case basis, embrace reforms and the struggle for them as part of the overall path of building class consciousness and a fighting spirit in the working class. However, you'll never hang on to those reforms indefinitely, as long as the capitalists are the ones controlling state power. So ultimately, fascism is about preventing the proletarian revolution. And you could look at it also as the consequence of an overdue revolution. In other words, when a revolutionary moment comes and goes and the proletariat misses that chance to end capitalism and start building socialism, fascism is what follows in its wake as the bourgeoisie try to seal the exit. And again, they'll use social democracy to buy themselves time, as long as, really anything that keeps workers away from revolution. But again, social democracy is just a tactic of the bourgeoisie. It is when bourgeois ideas enter into the workers' movement, and then the capitalists use that time that they bought themselves to construct a more terroristic capitalist state. And so there is this kind of transition between social fascism, social democracy, and regular fascism, based on the needs of the bourgeoisie once proletarian revolutions become possible. But there is a lot more to it, so again, go read Fascism and Social Revolution, which we have as an audiobook with commentary. It's an excellent book. It goes into so many different facets and details about fascism, its origins, its class basis, etc. I really wish I had read it many years ago, but we have it now as an audiobook. And before we get into the Dugin thing itself, I'd actually like to start by reading a quote. This is from the section called Is There a Theory of Fascism, from Chapter 9, The Theory and Practice of Fascism. So let's read. The first illusion that requires to be cleared out of the way is the illusion that there is a theory of fascism. in the same sense that there's a theory of liberalism, conservatism, communism, etc. Many intellectuals, while deploring the excesses of fascism, allowed themselves to be fascinated and drawn into elaborate speculative discussion of the, quote, philosophy of fascism, and are soon lost in the Sorbonian bog of alternating, quote, socialism or pseudo-socialism, capitalism, corporatism, strongman worship, high moral adjurations and platitudes, anti-immigrant agitation, appeals to, quote, unity, glorifications of war, torture gloating, deification of primitive man, denunciations of big business, idolization of captains of industry, the kicking of the dead corpse of the 19th century, and, quote, liberal democratic humanitarian superstitions, the exhumation of the considerably more putrescent corpses of mercantilism, absolutism, inquisitorial methods and caste conceptions, racial theories of the inferiority of all other human beings save the speaker's own tribe, anti-Semitism, Nordicism, and all the rest of it. The innocent may solemnly and painstakingly discuss at face value these miscellaneous theories which are provided to suit all tastes, but in fact their real importance is rather as symptoms and byproducts of the real system and basis of fascism than as its origin and reason for being. The reality of fascism is the violent attempt of decaying capitalism to defeat the proletarian revolution and forcibly arrest the growing contradictions of its whole development. All the rest is decoration and stage play, whether conscious or unconscious, to cover and make presentable or attractive this basic reactionary aim, which cannot be openly stated without defeating its purpose. So that's key. Fascism can't say openly what it's trying to do. Continuing, for this reason, the real scientific theory underlying fascism can be better studied in a document such as the Deutsche Führerbriefe or confidential bulletins of the Federation of German Industries, which were already quoted in the previous chapter, rather than in the propaganda statements for public consumption concerning its professed, quote, theories by the fascist leaders themselves. The confidential statement of the heads of finance capital defines plainly and without disguise the objective essence and purpose of fascism as seen by its actual paymasters and controllers. It is therefore of primary scientific and theoretical importance for the real understanding of fascism. Such a statement makes plain that fascism is solely a tactical method of finance capital, in exactly the same way as the support of democratic forms and of social democratic governments was also a tactical method, either being supported with equal readiness according to circumstances to defeat the proletarian revolution, to divide the exploited population, and so to maintain capitalist rule. All the propaganda, quote, theories, mythological trimmings, supposed, quote, new school of political thought, etc., only constitute a smokescreen to cover this aim. Okay, so with that said, that's actually going to serve as a good basis for approaching everything that we're going to look at in this video. And again, keep in mind, why did I mention the American, quote, Communist Party of Hinkle and Infracel? Well, just earlier this year, here's Jackson Hinkle saying Professor Alexander Dugin on America's role in the multipolar world. There he had posted an interview that he did with Dugin. And why? Well, here's his buddy Infracel, who did the same thing, interviewing Dugin. He said, I had the great honor of speaking to Professor Alexander Dugin while in Moscow. I have been greatly influenced by many of Dugin's ideas for some time. Let's read that again. I've been greatly influenced by many of Dugin's ideas for some time. But after speaking to him both on and off camera, I can confidently say I have met one of the most powerful minds of our era. So before we get into how this plays into some of the quote-unquote MAGA-communism quote-unquote theory that is underpinning Infracel's whole thing and the founding of the ACP, let's do a critical reading of one of the products of one of the quote most powerful minds of our era, according to Infracel. And this is Fascism, Borderless and Red, 1997. There are, in the 20th century, only 3 ideologies that have managed to demonstrate that their principles are realistic in terms of their political administrative implementation. These are liberalism, communism, and fascism. Comment: fascism is not a separate ideology. Quoting from Fascism and Social Revolution by Dutt again, fascism endeavors to present itself as a third alternative distinct from either capitalism or socialism. To the workers, fascism insists that it does not stand for capitalism. To the employers, fascism insists that it does not stand for socialism. For its supposed distinct positive conception, that is, it positively is its own thing and not just the absence of something else, it remains extremely vague. Only after several years of existence, Italian fascism worked out the formula of the so-called corporate state to cover its aim. And German fascism worked out the formula of, quote, National Socialism. Both these formulas are intended to represent the supposed, quote, third alternative, capitalism or socialism. This supposed third alternative, the will-o'-the-wisp dream of petty bourgeois ideology ever since the development of capitalism and the class struggle, remains a myth and can never be other than a myth. It is in fact nothing but a repetition of the old petty bourgeois dream of a class society without class contradictions or class struggle, but this time used to cover in reality the most violently coercive class state and class suppression. Skipping ahead slightly, economically there can only be capitalism or socialism in the conditions of modern society based on large-scale industry. What is capitalism? Capitalism is marked by 1. Production for profit, 2. Class ownership of the means of production, 3. Employment of the dispossessed workers or proletariat for wages. What is socialism? Socialism is marked by 1. Common ownership of the means of production by the workers, constituting the entire society, and 2. Production for use. Skipping ahead again, hence the most typical characteristics of modern capitalism or imperialism, with the increasing role of the state in its organization, are described as socialism, while the realities of wage labor, profits, and class division are unchanged and even intensified. This muddle-headed confusion, which is common to all capitalist, laborist, and fascist ideology, and is the breeding ground for all the demagogic attempts of fascism to conceal its capitalist character, becomes impossible as soon as the class analysis of capitalism is understood. Fascism, by all the above tests, is economically identical with capitalism, representing only a special method to maintain its power and hold down the workers. Fascism is profit-making society, is class society, a society based on exploitation. End quote. And that was shown in the economic realities of fascist Italy, Austria, and Germany. So already the Dugin piece, right in its first line, is already asserting that fascism is something distinct. It is not. This is actually a claim of the fascists themselves, and from a Marxist-Leninist perspective, it should be totally discounted. Continuing, as much as one may like to, it is impossible to name another model of society which would not be one of the forms of these ideologies and which, at the same time, existed in reality. There are liberal countries, there are communist countries, and there are fascist, nationalist countries. Others are absent and are impossible. And again, as we've said, both what Dugin is calling liberalism and fascism are capitalism. They are, from a class perspective, the same thing. Continuing, in Russia, we have passed 2 ideological stages, the communist and the liberal. What remains is fascism. Time out. So there's sort of an implicit claim here that these are stages that a society passes through. From an accurate historical materialist perspective, that doesn't make sense. As Marxist historical materialism states, the earlier period of feudalism gives rise to capitalism. It creates the capitalist class, and so contains the seeds of its own destruction. And so too capitalism creates a large proletariat, the class interests of which do not indicate an indefinite lifespan for capitalism. The proletariat has no material interest in continuing that indefinitely, and definitely will start to struggle against it. And when the proletariat is successful, the system that it builds, the system that is in line with its material interests, is socialism. Abolition of private property, which the proletariat doesn't own, and production for use rather than profit. So fascism is not some third ideological stage. It's just such a bizarre statement. In Russia, we have passed 2 ideological stages, the communist and the liberal. What remains is fascism. It's so pseudo-intellectual, which is so typical of Dugin and the philosophy-brained chuds that follow him. Where fascism arises in history is where the bourgeoisie is trying to fight off proletarian revolution. It's not some other stage that is even necessary to go through. It's just capitalism in decay fighting to hang on to its social order. Now, as far as where Russia was in the mid to late 90s when this was written, it was chaos. The economy went through the government, and the government was dismantled. So the entire economic system was in shambles. Capitalists, both foreign and domestic, were trying to buy up everything that they could, and they were getting it extremely cheap. Organized crime, which is just business that gets its hands dirtier than usual, was on the rise. And yeah, it was just kind of a free-for-all. Everything seemed to be up for grabs, including ideology. And Dugin had had in fact been one of the co-founders of the Nazbol National Bolshevik Party in Russia. So, he was not some casual observer or just commentator off to the side. He was somebody who was involved in politics and trying to make a play. Again, the historical backdrop is full capitalist restoration in the USSR, which brought in a gigantic drop in living standards and lifespan shortened. It was a terrible time, but that doesn't really excuse promoting fascism. Anyway, first section, against national capitalism. One of the versions of fascism which it seems Russian society is today ready, or almost ready to embrace is national capitalism. It is almost beyond doubt that the project of national capitalism, or quote, right fascism, constitutes an ideological initiative of that part of the elite of society which is seriously concerned with the problem of power and feels acutely the power of time. What are you talking about? Yet the, quote, national capitalist, quote, right-wing variation of fascism does by no means exhaust the nature of this ideology. Moreover, the union of the, quote, national bourgeoisie with the intelligentsia, on which, according to some analysts, the coming Russian fascism will be based, constitutes a glaring example for what actually is entirely alien to fascism as a worldview, as a doctrine, and as a style. Quote, the domination of national capital. This is a Marxist definition of the phenomenon of fascism. Just like to comment, there's no citation for that there, and I don't think that's a very good definition. Continuing, it does absolutely not take into account the specific philosophical self-reflection of fascist ideology and consciously ignores the fundamental core pathos of fascism, which, again, Marxism is not concerned with because it's concerned with class struggle, which is actually the motive force of history. But continuing, fascism. This is nationalism, yet not any nationalism, but a revolutionary, rebellious, romantic, idealistic form of nationalism appealing to a great myth and transcendental idea, trying to put into practice the impossible dream, to give birth to a society of the hero and the Superman, to change and transform the world. Yeah, this is all the mythical nonsense that they build into it to conceal its basic purpose, as we were just reading earlier. On the economic level, fascism is characterized rather by socialist or moderately socialist methods which subordinate personal, individual economic interests to the principles of national welfare, justice, and brotherhood. So comment, you can see the links here to social democracy. But even this description by Dugin is not really accurate. But continuing, and finally, the fascist view of culture corresponds to a radical rejection of the humanistic, quote, excessively humane mentality, i.e., of what represents the essence of the intelligentsia. The fascist hates the intellectual as a type. He sees in him a masked bourgeois, a pretentious Philistine, a chatterbox, and irresponsible coward. The fascist loves the brutal, superhuman, and angel-like at the same time. It can be your devil and your angel. But really, while this may appeal to some socially clueless edgelords, for those of us who understand ruling class ideology to be reflections of the material needs of the ruling class, how do you not see that this is a capitalism which needs to be more brutal, more violent, more anti-intellectual, more hateful and cruel because it is trying to oppose the will of the masses who yearn for liberation? Remember, the actual core purpose of fascism is to block socialist revolution. So the ideology it comes up with is all about meeting that aim. Continuing, he loves the cold and tragedy. He does not like warmth and comfort. In other words, fascism despises everything that makes up the essence of national capitalism. It fights for the domination of national idealism. These are in quotes, but I have no idea what it's supposed to be quoting. And not national capital, and against the bourgeoisie and intelligentsia, and not for it and not with it. So commenting, this is again an angle of fascism which tries to present itself as anti-capitalist. It often does this. But again, as the only two modes of production that an advanced industrial society can be based on are capitalism and socialism, it has to be one or the other. And as we've heard, it's only moderately socialist, meaning that it's preserving private property, etc. But the fascists, while preserving private property, are somehow not fighting with it. Except that's not how it works. You have to pick a side. So fascism, again, is about muddying the waters, confusing, and delaying the revolution. This kind of misdirection, that's what it's all about. So continuing, the fascist pathos is accurately defined in the famous phrase of Mussolini, who, by the way, never take anything that Mussolini says at face value. He's constantly contradicting himself, and he would declare one thing passionately one day, and as soon as he got orders from capitalists to do otherwise, he would just change it. And there's a million examples of that in Fascism and Social Revolution. Anyway, the famous phrase of Mussolini, rise, fascist, end proletarian Italy. Okay, fascist and proletarian. Such is the orientation of fascism. It is a labor and heroic, militant and creative, idealistic and futuristic ideology which does not have anything in common with securing additional governmental comfort for the traders, even if 1,000 times national, and sinecures for the socially parasitic intelligentsia. So they want to do a kind of capitalism which is super anti-intellectual and is supposedly against the established traders. So it's this sort of meritocracy just based on brutality. And I don't know who this would appeal to other than people who've already bought into basically other toxically masculine, hyper-competitive ideology and think that they're going to come out on top. To anybody else, this would sound like torture. Continuing, the central figures of the fascist state and fascist myth are the peasant, worker, and soldier. Well, yeah, they're going to kiss your ass just so that they keep you confused. But anyway, on the top, as the supreme symbol of the tragic fight with destiny, what? Cosmic entropy is the godlike leader. Okay. Duce, Führer, superhuman, really, who realizes in his supra-individual personality the extraordinary tension of national will for feet. Of course, somewhere at the periphery, there is also a place for the honest citizen merchant and university professor. They too put on party badges and go out to ceremonial meetings. But in fascist society, their figures are fading, getting lost, and move into the background. Let me ask, toward what end, though? So when we say that fascism is the organized expression of social decay, this is what we're talking about. It's basically an attempt at a managed collapse of all the things that capitalism has innovated and built, because yes, Marxists do recognize that capitalism is progressive compared to feudalism, but it's reactionary compared to socialism. And as Lenin said, the socialists need to try to preserve the cultural and other achievements of bourgeois society while abolishing private property and the other things that keep the proletariat back from actual liberation and actual freedom under bourgeois restrictions and overall the reign of the bourgeoisie. So as capitalism starts to go down the toilet and dragging everything with it, they're trying to pretend basically like they're doing this on purpose and being like, yeah, there's a fight with destiny and all this stuff. And it's like, no, your system is just destroying itself. We need to move on. Anyway, continuing, not for them and not by them, meaning the honest citizen merchant and university professor, is the national revolution done. But again, commenting, I know that was just one sentence, but this is, such nonsense. It needs to be commented on fairly frequently. The national revolution is not done by fascists. That's something done by capitalism much earlier. The capitalists fairly early on, again, need to establish a national market. It's only from there that imperialism develops, which is more internationalist on top of it, where those borders, again, become somewhat hindrances to the flow of capital. But the bourgeoisie need to maintain that. It is a contradiction that they can't really fully do away with. Only socialism can truly be international, but fascism does oftentimes make a play at this kind of, we've got nationalism, but we've resolved the contradictions. And there's a fascist internationalism, which is actually based on intense nationalism. It's, again, contradiction and nonsense. Fascism solves none of these problems. It's just trying to preserve the rule of capital and delay the inevitable, the proletarian revolution and the building of socialism. Continuing, in history, clean, ideal fascism did not experience a direct incarnation. And commenting, I think that that's basically the pitch here, that we're going to do a real fascism, borderless and red. Yeah, they always say this, always. But, it's like the not real socialism. It's not real fascism. So that's what he's calling for, real fascism. In practice, the urgent problems of assumption of power and establishing economic order, like existing in the world, forced the fascist leaders, including Mussolini, Hitler, Franco, as well as Salazar, to forge alliances with conservatives. Now that's funny, as if that wasn't the main base of fascism in the first place. It obviously borrowed from socialism. Mussolini, for example, used to be an actual socialist until he got on the MI5 payroll and then started beating up anti-World War I protesters. And that is an actual fact, by the way. But yeah, the purpose is always to defend capitalism, so of course there's going to be mainly a conservative base. Continuing, national capitalists, big owners, and corporation heads. Yeah, those were just, oh, they had to forge alliances. No, that's who they were working for, always. Yet this compromise always ended deplorable for the fascist regimes. Well, no, it's just that it didn't really work, or it worked only to a limited extent. The fanatic anti-communism of Hitler, warmed up by the German capitalists, cost Germany the defeat in its war with the USSR. Really, so you're just going to blame the German capitalists for that, as if Hitler wasn't an eager and enthusiastic anti-communist in his own right. Anyway, while Mussolini, trusting into the honesty of the king, which, any principled, intelligent person definitely would do who's trying to bring revolution to a country, revolution in several sets of scare quotes there. Anyway, trusting into the honesty of the king, articulator of the interests exactly of big business, yeah, so surprising, was delivered by him to the renegades Badoglio and Ciano, who put the Duce into prison and threw themselves into the embrace of the Americans. Franco held out the longest, and even that because of the concessions of liberal capitalist England and USA. Wait, are you telling me that the USA... No, I don't believe it. Wait, this guy's saying that the USA is willing to prop up anti-communist regimes? No, that can't be true. I'll be right back. Okay, I'm back, and I did some reading, and apparently that is a thing that happens. All right. And because of his rejection to support the ideologically related regimes of the Axis. Moreover, Franco was not a real fascist. Period. That's bold. You gotta love he wasn't a real fascist. Moving on. What does that mean? National capitalism is the inner virus of fascism, its enemy and guarantor of its degeneration and perishing. National capitalism is in no way an essential characteristic of fascism, as national capitalism is, on the contrary, an accidental and contradictory element in its inner structure. So time out. He's saying that, obviously fascism arises out of capitalist countries, and of the only two possible modes of production for an advanced industrial society, capitalism and socialism, it does preserve private property. Going back to chapter 9 of Dutt's book, this is a section, Capitalism, Socialism, and the Corporate State, there's a quote from the Fascist Week, an article, Fascism Calling to the Industrialists and Businessmen. The quote is, "Fascism differs from socialism chiefly in this, that in the corporate state, you will be left in possession of your business." January 1934. So if Dugin's saying that actually capitalism is a problem for fascism and something that it needs to overcome, how is it going to do that? I think literally magic is the answer. For those who don't know, Dugin was involved in all kinds of occult stuff, which is neither here nor there, but it does represent his appeals to mysticism and the just sort of living in the imagination, fantasyland kind of approach to politics and society, I guess. This is, again, not uncommon either in fascist movements. There's a basic irrationalism which is promoted as part of the capitalists' very rational strategy to keep people away from social scientific thinking, revolution, etc. This is why Michael Parenti's book on the topic, Black Shirts and Reds, Rational Fascism and the Overthrow of Capitalism, has rational fascism in its title. Fascism is irrational, and that kind of occult, mystical stuff is part of that, deployed in this context as a class weapon of the bourgeoisie. But in the fourth political theory, Dugin references, for example, Julius Evola, an Italian fascist who attempted to develop a sort of official fascist mysticism that would become part of the fabric of the Italian fascism, which was intended to rule for a much longer period than it actually did. So par for the course, and you'll find these kind of occult references throughout Dugin's stuff. Anyway, so how does the virus of national capitalism relate to Russia and what he's talking about? Therefore, in our case, in the case of the growing Russian national capitalism, one cannot speak about fascism, but of an attempt to preliminarily pervert what is not to be circumvented. So basically, he's saying here that Russia must go on and develop fascism. So let's just flash back real quick again. I have been greatly influenced by many of Dugin's ideas for some time. One of the most powerful minds of our era. Really. Continuing, such pseudo-fascism can be called preventive or precautionary. It hastens to make itself known before an authentic, real, radically revolutionary and consistent fascism, a fascist fascism. I just lost a few IQ points, is in full measure born and becomes strong in Russia. National capitalists, these are former Communist Party leaders who are used to bossing around and humiliating the people, and who subsequently, out of conformism, became liberal Democrats, and who, now that this stage is over, are equally zealously venturing to cover themselves with national clothes. So comment here, this is not entirely inaccurate. When we talk about the restoration of capitalism in the USSR, this isn't just something that started with Gorbachev. It's why we study the struggles against modern revisionism under Khrushchev and Brezhnev, and even earlier, Stalin's struggles against Trotskyism, against the Nepmen, and all the other kind of petty bourgeois and reformist lines that were laying dormant at times and then engaged in active struggle at times, but which unfortunately did win out. And that's why we have to look at the Sino-Soviet split and criticisms in the late 50s and the 60s and 70s of what was going on in the USSR. Anyway, continuing, having democracy transformed into a farce, apparently the partocrats, together with the obliging intelligentsia, are decidedly up to foul and poison the nationalism that is advancing into society. So some of the translation here is a little bit rough, but I think that you get the idea. So anyway, what does Dugin think of this? The nature of fascism is a new hierarchy, a new aristocracy. The novelty lies in that the hierarchy is based on natural, organic, and clear principles. Dignity, honor, courage, and heroism. Time out, none of those are natural, organic, or clear. They're also identical to the same rallying cries that fascists used in Italy and Germany and Austria and other countries in the 20s and 30s. As Dutt said in Fascism and Social Revolution, these are just bourgeois platitudes, the same kind of things you can hear conservatives anywhere talking about. Duty, honor, national unity, etc. There's nothing novel about that at all. Continuing, the dilapidated hierarchy which is trying to carry itself over into the era of nationalism, which again, capitalism already is that, but anyway, is as before, based on conformist abilities. I find it hilarious. There's a fascist talking against conformism. That's kind of funny, but flexibility, caution, a taste for intrigues, toadyism, etc. The obvious conflict between two styles, two human types, two normative systems is inescapable. So I think the idea that he's trying to paint here of the emerging brutal anti-intellectual rulership is something like out of a sword and sorcery novel. But you would basically have to be on, like a juvenile adolescent mindset to think that this is anything other than stage dressing and a cover for the actual profits, the actual ownership of industry, which is enjoyed by a small exploiting parasitical class. It's basically just attempting to justify that on the basis that these people are somehow superhuman. It's just a reincarnation of the divine right of kings, more or less. Anyway, Section 2, Russian Socialism. It is absolutely unjustified to call fascism a, quote, extremely right-wing ideology. Yeah, I would beg to differ, but let's hear what he has to say. After all, he's one of the most powerful minds. This phenomenon is much more precisely characterized with the paradoxical formula, conservative revolution. Yeah, well, at least he acknowledges that that is a paradox, but other people promoting this do not. You may recall, for example, Infracel's whole communism is conservative thing. No, communism is revolutionary. That means overturning the existing order, pushing on into the future, historical progress. Conservatism is the opposite of that. It's right in the name, conserve. It means to hold on to what already exists. So yeah, paradoxical formula indeed. Continuing, it is a combination of a, quote, right-wing, cultural political orientation, traditionalism, faithfulness to the soil, okay, roots, national ethics, with a, quote, left-wing economic program. Yeah, except it doesn't do this at all. There's actually a huge economic breakdown of fascism in Fascism and Social Revolution. The fascist countries actually had poor economic outcomes, and they got hit by the Great Depression as hard as any other non-fascist country. In fact, all of the imperialist countries are fascistic to some degree. The only question is to what degree? Have they completed the fascist dictatorship, or are there only elements of it? So yeah, the left-wing economic program, that's total horseshit. So anyway, he continues, and this is great. Social justice is one example of the fascist left-wing economic program. So yeah, we're actually talking about putting disabled people, people of different religions, trade unionists, communists in camps. That's social justice. Okay. limitation to the market forces, again, not really, deliverance from credit slavery. I mean, these were slogans that they had, but what did they do in practice? Prohibition of stock market speculation, monopolies and trusts. I mean, to some extent, all of these things are prohibited, or at least limited and regulated in any capitalist society to, again, a greater or lesser degree. Monopolies and trusts, and the primacy of honest work. What does that even fucking mean? In analogy to National Socialism, which was often called simply German socialism, one can speak of Russian fascism as Russian socialism. So here's where I would just throw this up in the air and walk away, but we're doing a video, so we'll continue. The ethnic specification of the term socialism has, in this context, a special meaning. Can't wait. What is meant is formulation of a socio-economic doctrine from the beginning, not on the basis of abstract dogmas and rationalistic laws, but on the basis of concrete. My head is exploding trying to read this. But on the basis of concrete, and then listen to the next word, spiritual, ethical, and cultural principles that have organically formed the nation as such. This is about as anti-materialist as you can get right here. So what is meant is the formulation of a socio-economic doctrine from the beginning, not on the basis of, and I think is omitted, as in the case of Marxism, quote, abstract dogmas and rationalistic laws, i.e. scientific socialism, but on the basis of concrete spiritual, ethical, and cultural principles. You cannot use concrete and spiritual next to each other like that. That does not work. Anyway, this is garbage, but let's continue. Russian socialism, that is not Russians for socialism, but socialism for the Russians. So again, this is in stark contrast to Stalin, for example, who specified that there is no socialism with Chinese characteristics or Russian characteristics or English, French, etc. So actually, let's just read that real quick because it's actually highly relevant. Titled J.V. Stalin on, quote, National Marxism and the General Laws of Socialism. This is from July 11, 1949. Stalin said, "You speak of Sinified or Chinese socialism. There is nothing of the sort in nature. There is no Russian, English, French, German, Italian socialism, as much as there is no Chinese socialism. There is only one Marxist-Leninist socialism. It is another thing that in the building of socialism, it is necessary to take into consideration the specific features of a particular country. Socialism is a science, necessarily having, like all science, certain general laws, and one just needs to ignore them, and the building of socialism is destined to failure. What are these general laws of building socialism? 1. Above all, it is the dictatorship of the proletariat, the workers and peasant state, a particular form of the union of these classes under the obligatory leadership of the most revolutionary class in history, the class of workers. Only this class is capable of building socialism and suppressing the resistance of the exploiters and petty bourgeoisie. 2. Socialized property of the main instruments and means of production, expropriation of all the large factories and their management by the state. 3. Nationalization of all capitalist banks, the merging of all of them into a single state bank, and strict regulation of its functioning by the state. 4. The scientific and planned conduct of the national economy from a single center. Obligatory use of the following principle in the building of socialism, from each according to his capacity, to each according to his work. Distribution of the material good depending upon the quality and quantity of the work of each person. And commenting, that is the principle of the lower stage of socialism. It is in communism where it is to each according to need. But these are the laws of building socialism, and that is how you start out. 5. Obligatory domination of Marxist-Leninist ideology. 6. The creation of armed forces that would allow the defense of the accomplishments of the revolution, and always remember that any revolution is worth anything only if it is capable of defending itself. And 7. Ruthless armed suppression of counter-revolutionaries and foreign agents. These, in short, are the main laws of socialism as a science, requiring that we relate to them as such. If you understand this, everything with the building of socialism in China will be fine. If you won't, you will do great harm to the international communist movement. As far as I know in the CPC, there is a thin layer of the proletariat, and the nationalist sentiments are very strong. And if you do not conduct genuinely Marxist-Leninist class policies and do not conduct struggle against bourgeois nationalism, the nationalists will strangle you. Then not only will socialist construction be terminated, China may become a dangerous toy in the hands of American imperialists. In the building of socialism in China, I strongly recommend you to fully utilize Lenin's splendid work, The Immediate Tasks of Soviet Power. This would assure success. Anyway, brief aside there, that's the end of that document, and always a good thing to revisit, I think. But relevant here, and it gave us a nice little break from this fucking fascist garbage we've been reading. But anyway, where did we leave off? In analogy to National Socialism, which was often simply called German Socialism, one can speak of Russian fascism as Russian Socialism. The ethnic specification of the term socialism has, in this context, a special meaning. What is meant is formulation of a socio-economic doctrine from the beginning, not on the basis of abstract dogmas and rationalistic laws, in other words, not on the basis of social science, but on the basis of concrete spiritual, ethical, and cultural principles that have organically formed the nation as such. Russian socialism, that is not Russians for socialism, but socialism for the Russians. So, that actually may be not that inaccurate to call that Russian fascism. To take this nationalized perversion of socialism. As Stalin said, there's only one socialism. It's a universal Marxist-Leninist socialism. If you depart from those laws of socialist construction, you're going to get something else. Your building of socialism is going to fail. What are you going to get? Some form of capitalism with some socialist dressing. In other words, somewhere between social fascism and just regular fascism. So Dugin continues, in distinction to rigid Marxist-Leninist dogmas, yes, or Marxist-Leninist social scientific laws, Russian National Socialism proceeds from an understanding of social justice, which is characteristic exactly for our nation, for our historical tradition, for our economic ethics. Wow, economic ethics says a whole lot. We're no longer going off of which class owns industry, etc. We're now just going off of there are ethics that our people kind of like, and we're going to end up a million miles away from anything like socialism or communism. Such a socialism, put those in again like triple scare quotes, will be more rural than proletarian, more communal and cooperative than administrative, more regionalistic than centralistic. What was one of those laws? You have to do central planning. All these are requirements of Russian national specificity. Would you care to explain that? First of all, it's not going to result in socialism, but also what is it about Russia that has that for its national specificity that the Russians specify? We need those things, which will find its expression in the doctrine and not only in practice. Okay, well, we'll have to take your word for that if we so choose, because there is no explanation, there's no reasoning or evidence. Section 3, New People. Such a Russian socialism should be built by new people, a new type of people, a new class. Okay, so here's something that definitely has overlap with Marxism. We're going to talk about class, but what kind of class? Well, Dugin says, a class of heroes and revolutionaries. Heroes. So we're back to sword and sorcery again. The remains of the party nomenclature and their ramshackle order should fall victim to the socialist revolution, which is actually a fascist revolution, because he said that they already went through liberalism and socialism, and now they have to do fascism. So he is now saying, and that was just said at the end of section 2, one can speak of Russian fascism as Russian socialism. So he's saying that the socialist revolution is going to claim the party, but actually that socialism is fascism. Okay, next sentence, the Russian national revolution. The Russians are longing for freshness, for modernity. What are these things? Idealism much? For unfeigned romanticism. Is that what they're longing for? For bullshit. For living participation in some great cause. Whether it benefits their class or not, they just want to be part of it. They just want something to do. Everything that they are offered today is either archaic, the national patriots, or boring and cynical, the liberals. The dance and the attack, fashion and aggression, excessiveness and discipline, will and gesture, fanaticism and irony will seethe in the national revolutionaries. Young, malicious, sounds so tempting, merry, fearless, passionate, and not knowing limits, or not knowing anything of decency, humanity, a better future, etc. They will build and destroy, rule and fulfill orders, conduct purges of the enemies of the nation, and tenderly take care of Russian elderly and children. Wow, this is a steaming pile of crap. Wrathfully and merrily will they approach the citadel of the ramshackle and rotten system, while studying the blade, I assume. Yes, they deeply thirst for power. They know how to use it. They will breathe life into society. They will shove the people into the sweet process of creating history, new people. Finally, intelligent and brave, such as are needed, who take the outer world as a strike in the words of Evgeny Golovin, a Russian mystic and one of Dugin's teachers. So again, where are these people going to come from? Like, Dugin has just laid out this image of these kind of fascist youth tearing things apart, but also being tender towards the elderly and etc. Well, what's the recipe for creating people like this? Why will they have these motivations that you're describing? Again, it's left up to the imagination. I guess he's going to cast a magic spell. Immediately before his death, the French fascist writer, Robert Brasillach, voiced a strange prophecy. Quote, "I see how in the East, in Russia, fascism is arising, a fascism borderless and red." Unquote. Note, this is not a faded, brownish, pinkish national capitalism, but the blinding dawn of a new Russian revolution. Fascism, borderless as our lands, and red as our blood. And there you have Dugin's vision. That's the end. So can we please put aside this notion that Dugin, who again was 35 at the time that he wrote that, and had participated in the founding of a fascist political party, is not a fascist, or that people who claim to take massive inspiration from him should be tolerated, or that people who co-found new political parties with those disciples of Dugin should be tolerated either. So, for example, here is Noah of the Midwestern Mussolini Collective, making excuses for Dugin and the people who follow him. So this is posted this year on Twitter. I would suggest reading Dugin yourself rather than judging a guy from his early 20s. Well, we're not judging him from his early 20s, and I get that. I mean, actually, people in their 20s, you're politically learning. That's a time when people generally, from like a developmental perspective, are starting to switch from personal and family awareness into broader social consciousness. And depending on in what society you're trying to do that in, that may take longer or shorter period of time to come to some kind of actually good class-based politics that represent your actual class interests and an actual path to freedom for the poor and exploited peoples of the world. But I think that we can contrast that kind of a situation with Dugin, who clearly was very committed to the fascist movement. And I would say, judging from even his more recent writings, still is, no matter how he might be more skillful today at cloaking that in, however he's trying to sell it, the geopolitics, Eurasia stuff. So yeah, anyway, rather than how he has changed since then, I would argue he really hasn't changed very much at all. He's a postmodern thinker that sees the world in terms of civilizations. He isn't a Nazi. He isn't a fascist. He is a conservative Russian postmodernist. Now, again, this is just running cover for a guy who very clearly is a fascist. And the fourth political theory, sort of like the main work that he's known for, is just chock full of all the kinds of, we'll take something from Marx, but we're going to bend it here. And, it's trying to dress up capitalist politics in some kind of revolutionary or socialist dressing, which is exactly what he was describing at the end of Fascism, Borderless and Red. Too much craziness on the left, calling everyone a fascist. Well, I think in this case it's justified. And actually, I'll say it's unreasonable to say that it isn't. So it's, just craziness on, everything I don't like is fascism. Well, I would say that people who write essays calling for fascism, borderless, and red, yeah, I would say that person, there you're justified. Anyway, they take one thing or represent things out of context and go bonkers on it. Well, what's the context that makes this okay? Please tell me. These same leftists fundamentally view things along the lines of Hitler, but express it differently a lot of the time, have the same philosophical foundations and assumptions, the will as driver of social reality, etc. What are you talking about? For me, this is in response to Dugin's fascism. Now we're talking about these leftists are Hitler, which incidentally, we're going to talk about the Rise of MAGAcommunism essay by Infracel, one of, again, the co-founders of the American quote-unquote Communist Party, which again, Noah is one of the signatories of. And there's this same ranting in there about the leftists are Nazis. That's like, I'd say 50% of the piece is basically that. Anyway, for me, Noah, it serves a far greater purpose to actually engage with things on their own terms and understand them than it does to try to get people to dismiss them. Well, we just read word for word through that entire thing and did try to put it into context. It's just rehashed, warmed over original wave fascism because fascism is very shallow. It has one purpose. It is to try to confuse people into abandoning the revolution and to suppressing and opposing people who still try to pursue it. So anyway, yeah, that's engaging with it on its terms. So doing that only makes people interested in them. Well, again, we're not doing that, but even that argument, like, do you think that the entire mass of the population has the mentality of like a 13-year-old? So just strange. You know why I, Noah, know that Nazi doctrine is objectively wrong? I don't know, was it the genocides? Because I engaged with its theory. Okay, but you're saying that you've engaged with the theory of Dugin, although he actually says elsewhere that he hasn't really engaged, he hasn't read that much of Dugin, etc. So which is it? So you know that Dugin's okay. He's just a misunderstood, conservative postmodernist, but you haven't actually engaged with the theory. Well, that's where you're ending your argument here, because I engaged with its theory. But you haven't done that with Dugin, but you're running cover for other people you are now closely politically associated with who are all about Dugin. Again, Infracel, co-founder of the ACP with you, quote, I have been greatly influenced by many of Dugin's ideas for some time. So let's actually lift the lid on that. Someone recommended that I read The Rise of MAGAcommunism by Infracel. It's from September 18, 2022, so less than 2 years ago. And I would say that this is Duginist through and through. First of all, it's terribly written. I would never want to read this whole thing out. First of all, if you convert it to PDF, it's 34 pages, overlong, and just so pretentiously and badly written. It is trying so hard at all times. All kinds of random phrases are put in italics for like no particular reason. But as far as the communism goes, is this person the vanguard, some kind of theoretical leader who should be forming a vanguard party that you should join? No. Let's just take a few quotes, which there's absolutely no context which can possibly justify them. Here on page 24, we have, quote, communists do not want to, in quotes, socialize people's actual belongings. True, if you mean personal property like toothbrushes. Correct. Or even businesses. Wrong. Profoundly wrong. Communists do not want to socialize people's businesses. What kind of communist are you? I would say not a communist. Actually, that's extremely reminiscent of the quote that we read before in Dutt, the thing taken from the Fascist Week article, Fascism Calling to the Industrialists and Businessmen, quote, fascism differs from socialism chiefly in this, that in the corporate state, you will be left in possession of your business. I mean, that's basically the same thing. We don't want to socialize your business. That's the exact same sentiment, same outcome. So the fascists, though, dressed this up as something else, and the German fascists called it National Socialism, and then Dugin's calling it Russian Socialism. Well, here we've got an adaptation to the American petty bourgeois landscape, MAGAcommunism. It's all the same thing, though. It's not socialist. Let's continue. Communists do not want to socialize people's actual belongings, right, or even businesses. What? The way in which actual relations of production will develop will be a matter of history. Okay, that sentence says nothing. Marx and Engels, something, it's an incomplete sentence, that through the course of the, stated that through the course of the actual development of the productive forces, and we're starting to get on real shaky ground here, the institution of private property will become superfluous. Well, capitalism has contradictions which block further development, but they continue because productive relations will develop as forms of free association. Production will have a substantive human quality based on relations between people rather than abstractions like money. And here we go. Communists do not want to force this outcome on people, but allow it to happen. Really? So what's a revolution? Why have all communists been for revolution? This is actually sounding a lot more like growing into socialism. So like Bernstein, Kautsky, renegade opportunists and traitors to the working class. Communists do not want to force this outcome on people, but allow it to happen. Then what is the role of a communist? So read what is to be done. I mean, is this just spontaneity, just documenting what the masses are doing, just allowing it to happen? What? It could not happen at the expense of what the people want. I mean, that's true in that the masses drive history, but the masses are also driven by material interests, which the capitalists are constantly trying to get us to ignore and have consciousness of other things instead of that. It could only happen as a result of the people's own historical development. Yeah, but I mean, that's communists agitate, educate, and organize toward that purpose because capitalism causes immense suffering and we need to get through it as fast as possible into where it's going to go inevitably if we survive that long. Socialism or extinction. Socialism is inevitable in the sense that if humanity has a future, it's a socialist one, but we don't necessarily have a future. And that is something that communists actively do have to help to bring about. That's the whole thing of the vanguard. Again, read what is to be done. They continue, in the meantime, what communists seek is the overthrow of the monopolists, the bankers, big pharma, big agriculture, big tech, and others which have hijacked the American Republic, this is just conservative language, in the name of the sacred institution of private property. I mean, that's what the American Republic is based on. I mean, that's what the whole system is about. This is what we have to move through, actually. And the only way to get through it is proletarian revolution. But you're saying you don't want to force this outcome on people. I mean, yes, like you can't do adventurous things that the masses don't support, but that's absolutely what communists are gearing up for, as soon as the masses realize its primacy and are ready to fight. Anyway, the second paragraph here on page 25 is where it starts getting really bad. The communist critique of private property allows for pro-people policies, including lowering taxation, ending government subsidies for the monopolists, and removing red tape, to actually happen because it places the interests of the people above the interests of money and so-called private property. Communists want the people to have more things, not less or fewer, more wealth, more businesses, and more prosperity. So that's like the Jackson Hinkle quote that we played in the last video where he's on that conservative talk show. It's like, we want people to have more businesses. What are you talking about? If the people have more of these things, then the productive forces accelerate faster. How did this guy even get into law school? I understand why he didn't make it through law school, but anyway, unleashing human prosperity and creativity to the point where things like Wall Street, the City of London, and other enemies of the people will never have the chance to take power again. So again, one of the things that these Nazballs get criticized for is that it's like this petty bourgeois approach that is basically capitalist in its orientation. And this is just the same. Again, it's like the mass base of fascism is the petty bourgeoisie because they dream, as we were just talking about earlier in the Dutt work, of a capitalism that's free of the class struggle, free of class contradictions, and that the petty bourgeoisie can just have this merry existence. Like that they're actually kind of the center of all of this. Anyway, the critique of private property doesn't mean taking property away from people. That's super interesting because actually the Communist Manifesto stated that bourgeois property is the highest form of private property and that communism could be summed up in a single phrase, the abolition of private property, meaning bourgeois property. So again, we're not talking about personal property. This whole thing is communicated terribly to the extent that, it even has any accurate message at all. But the critique of private property doesn't mean taking away property from people. Well, what does it mean? Answered in the next sentence, it means using political power in a way that serves the common interests of the people rather than the private interests of money. So you're a social democrat. And that's basically where this ends up, is just in reformism, because what's the next sentence? The contractual forms of association between the people, which allow people to secure their rights of ownership, will continue to exist far into the future and will only disappear when they are rendered unnecessary by the productive forces, when no institutional challenge to their ownership will even exist. So that is an anti-revolutionary statement that is growing into socialism. That's saying that capitalism can just keep going on and on and on, and it will basically just wither away. Well, no, it has to be ended in a proletarian revolution. But instead, Infracel is saying that, well, he's couching it in contractual forms of association between the people, but we're talking about private property here throughout the paragraph. So how is that abolished? Well, it will, quote, continue to exist far into the future, and it will only disappear when it, meaning private property, contractual forms of association, which again, contractual forms of association is such a bullshit way of removing yourself from what you're actually talking about. But when they're rendered unnecessary by the productive forces, when no institutional challenge to their ownership will even exist. Well, what's an institutional challenge to their ownership? He's talking about capitalists trying to defend capitalism. He's saying that basically capitalism will end just when the capitalists basically just walk away from capitalism. That's not how it works. That's ridiculous. It's completely anti-Leninist, for one thing. Lenin was saying over 100 years ago that conditions were already ripe for the proletariat to challenge capitalists for power. But Infracel's saying, no, you just got to wait for the productive forces to render capitalism unnecessary. Then they'll just disappear on their own, and the capitalists won't even challenge you. This is just social democracy. And it sounds to me like an extension of the Chinese idea of like, we just have to keep building up the productive forces and just magically, things happen on their own from there. Again, this is just Bernsteinian, Kautskian revisionism. You peel away the bluster, you peel away the ranting about leftists and breadtube and saying based every 3 seconds. That's what you got. So I'd like to close here. I said that the fourth political theory really isn't any better. And this is more the modern context, like in the last decade or so, what Dugin's defenders say we should be judging Dugin on. I mean, I'll be the judge of that for myself, but okay, you want us to read this? Well, this is from page 205 of the fourth political theory. Quote, if we free socialism, free it from its materialist, atheist, and modernist features. What, Dr. Philgiff? Materialist. So you want to free socialism from materialism, which is basically Marx and Engels' major contribution. So you want to go back to utopian idealist socialism. Sounds like a bad idea, but okay, that's what you're calling for. Atheist, again, that is hand in hand with materialism and modernist features. So that's definitely a bit vague, but modernism usually refers to grand historical narratives. I feel like a lot of times modernism is just sort of a veiled reference to Marxism itself, since historical materialism is pretty much the ultimate grand narrative of history, and it also posits that people can achieve liberation through a long historical struggle. So what are you left with if you, quote, free or decouple socialism from its materialist, atheist, and modernist or Marxist features? So you have something like pre-Marxian utopian socialism, which is not capable of really doing anything. And if we reject the racist and narrow nationalist aspects of the third way or openly fascist doctrines, which again are not actually a third way, they just call themselves that, they're capitalist, we arrive at a completely new kind of political ideology. You really don't. We call it the fourth political theory, or 4PT, the first being liberalism, that we essentially challenge, the second being the classical form of communism, the third being National Socialism and fascism. Its elaboration, or fourth political theory's elaboration, starts from the point of intersection between different anti-liberal political theories of the past, namely communism and the third way, or fascist theories, which again are just an extension of liberal political theories, again a more brutal form as capitalism went into deeper crises of profitability and of revolt in the colonial territories and of revolution from the working class. So yeah, it's just an extension of the same basic class interests represented in slightly different form, more brutal form, as they just had to crack down more and use more force to hang on to their social order against these challenges. Continuing, so we arrive at the National Bolshevism, and that was the party that he co-founded, that represents socialism without materialism, atheism, progressivism, and modernism. Now, we've added progressivism into what we're going to remove from socialism. What are you left? As well as the third way theories without racism and nationalism. But what do you have then? I mean, you have some of the promises of social democracy of ongoing reforms and restraint of capital, but basically that is just the social democracy. So if you're taking the racism and nationalism out, I mean, well, social democracy still has that anyway, to, I mean, maybe a less brazen extent than fascism, but yeah, what are you left with? But that's only the first step, okay? The mechanical addition of deeply revised versions of the anti-liberal ideologies of the past doesn't give us a final result. It is only a first approximation and preliminary approach. we must go further and make an appeal to tradition and to pre-modern sources of inspiration. There we have the Platonic ideal state, medieval hierarchical society, and theological visions of the normative social and political system, Christian, Islamic, Buddhist, Jewish, or Hindu. These pre-modern sources are a very important development to the National Bolshevism synthesis. Therefore, we need to find a new name for this kind of ideology, and fourth political theory is quite appropriate. It doesn't tell us what this theory is, but rather what it isn't. So it is a kind of invitation and appeal rather than dogma. So I will just point you back here to Fascism and Social Revolution in its discussions of how fascism essentially does not have any theory, just practice. So here's a quote from page 92 of the PDF that I link. Fascism, as its leaders are frequently fond of insisting, developed as a movement in practice without a theory. Quote, in the now distant March of 1919, says Mussolini in his encyclopedia article, since the creation of the Fascist Revolutionary Party, which took place in the January of 1915, I had no specific doctrinal attitude in my mind. Unquote, and it only later endeavored to invent a theory in order to justify its existence. Fascism, in fact, developed as a movement in practice in the conditions of threatening proletarian revolution as a counter-revolutionary mass movement supported by the bourgeoisie, employing weapons of mixed social demagogy and terrorism to defeat the revolution and build up a strengthened capitalist state dictatorship, and only later endeavored to adorn and rationalize this process with a, quote, theory. It is in this actual historical process that the reality of fascism must be found, and not in the secondary derivative attempts post festum at adornment with a theory. I think that that's exactly what you find in Dugin's mishmash of stuff. Well, we have to have, socialism without anything that makes socialism socialist. Then we're going to do fascism without racism and nationalism. Really? Then how are you going to get the workers to forget about revolution and their class-based problems? Then we're going to dig way back into the past, pre-modern stuff to try to justify the current class society hierarchy, which it is actually the historic task of the proletariat to crush and replace with a new socialist society moving toward a communist society. So again, people out there forming, quote, communist parties who are also saying that they've been greatly influenced by many of Dugin's ideas for some time, and who write incoherent nonsense as far as the manifesto, the rise of MAGAcommunism, which where it even attempts to discuss how capitalism will end, chalks it up to a long and gradual process of improvements in the productive forces, which eventually will just lead to capitalists abandoning the whole system. This is not the vanguard. This is not someone to listen to, and anyone closely associating with a person like this needs to be questioned. I mentioned Midwestern Mussolini before. They have been making rightist errors for a long time, but they've appeared for some time to be one of the more substantive Marxist media channels out there. I think that with the full-throated embrace of MAGA communism and this Duginism bullshit, which they are now connected to, like it or not, and they can do these sort of half denials and, oh, it's not important and whatever. I mean, Infracel is a Duginist through and through. I would not actually recommend reading The Rise of MAGAcommunism if you value your time. I actually have read it. It's Duginist through and through. I mean, it's a fascist document. So anyway, Midwestern Mussolini getting dragged down with that now. I've seen a lot of people in the comments on the last video on this topic saying they used to listen to them. They don't know why they're embracing Infracel and the MAGAcommunism thing. And, the ACP, may it sink like a stone, pulling everyone connected with it down to the bottomless depths where we never have to hear from them again. The basis of the ACP, MAGA communism, is revisionism.